Okay, yeah, that would be epic fail if I wouldn't be here, right?
Sorry?
That would be epic fail if you would just say, hey, Peter, he's so wonderful. Where's Peter? No, Peter. Okay, cool. Yeah, so, yeah, how many of you here loves open source? Contributes to open source? Maybe uses open source?
Everybody would have their hand up for that one.
Oh, no, I haven't checking, you know, like maybe somebody's taking a nap here. It's, you know, afternoon, so it's a fair thing to do. Well, we are going to talk about open source today, and let me highlight first my perspective, right? Kind of like start with a summary of a talk, if you will. Myself, I was involved in open source since late 90s, right? Oh my gosh, I think it's about 25 years now. I can't believe I'm so old. MySQL ABE is when I got first like professionally involved with open source, and then I started Percona. That is, you know, unusual company in the sense that everything we do is open source. All software is, we don't do open core, source available, or any of this stuff. I was CEO until recently, and now kind of moved to more of a founder role. And I'm also involved as an open source advocate as well as a mentor, advisor, sometimes investor in a variety of open source businesses. Now, so what is that perspective? Well, I believe what everything being equal, the open source choice is a better choice, right? A better choice from a lot of reasons. And what that means is if you think as investment, and investment, I mean investment personally as an individual, right, or as a company, it is better to invest that in open source rather than just paying for proprietary software. Because if you invest in open source, well, it comes back to you, right? You get to keep the benefit or fruits of your labor, of your investments forever. And if you invest in proprietary software licenses, then somebody like Larry just gets to have a bigger boat or buy another island, right? Well, not much benefit for you, right? So with that, let's look at history of open source briefly. And I would put it in a kind of a three different buckets, if you will. One is emerging open source. And I think what a few people don't realize is what the open source actually has a very, very long history. At the very dawn of computing, the software was what you would think about as an open source now, because software was not even a copyrightable item, right? I mean, it wasn't a thing when it was appeared, so vendors would sell you hardware, and then you get the software for free, right? And you could modify it at your own risk, right? Or for your own benefit. Again, the software was often very immature, right? Because that, and that's, that was needed at that point, right? Only later, when the software became a copyrightable license, that's the era of or the industry of proprietary software was born, right? And then for a while, we have all their proprietary software, and often created by the massive companies because the computers themselves, right, were so expensive, right? Until in the 1980s, I would say, we have their romantic open source, right, or free software movement, right, as it was more popular term initially, was born, right? And I think what was interesting and at that time is it was not really about money, right? Now, even if you think a little bit later, Linus Torvalds, right? And Linux as probably the most famous and successful open source software project. He wrote a book about why he started Linux, right? What was it? To become, stinky rich, to become super famous? No. His claims is what he started Linux just for fun. And I think that is a history, right, of a lot of early stage software time, right? People would do it. I think you can compare that to many scientists, right? Say, hey, you know what? We are doing that because, well, that is what we are excited to do, right? Not particularly to become rich. And then later, we figure out what the open source software is actually great. It can replace proprietary software, right? And that can be disruptive technology, right? And also it became more commercially entitled, right? It's interesting what we can see. Those events, I think, is quite interesting, right? We can see the folks at Microsoft noticing the open source, right? And they have been comparing, in particular, Linux to cancer, right? And it, because of that, GPL license, right? And I think that's also an interesting example, right? How the Microsoft position have changed in this regard, right? Over last 20 years. I was also involved in a MySQL IB, so I think that is a very significant event for me. Then Sun acquired MySQL, right? Right now, the $1 billion is not much for open source company, right? We have a number of companies which are valued in tens of billions, but at that time, $1 billion acquisition for open source company, that was a really very, very significant milestone of industry, right? And I think that was one of those things which also taught people, hey, you can actually start open source company, right, with their focus on doing a business, making money. Now, what I think is interesting at that point is what we are seeing some sort of a conflict between what was originally would think about like our romantic open source movement and the commercial companies, right? Because in the open source movement, it's about freedom, it's about the choice, about, hey, how we can let everybody innovate permissionless, right? How we are sharing, how we are doing the benefits for society, right? For everyone versus, well, commercial company profit, we create the moat, we lock your customers, how we can create monopoly, how we can capture the most value, and so on and so forth, right? So, and what that leaves us, and I think we saw that very much over the last 2 years, is this really their conflict. What the companies, especially as they mature, they become not just, maybe romantic founder control anymore, right? They have boards, they go public, they tend to pursue their shareholder value, which tends to erode their open source commitment, right? Now, here is just some examples of companies which do something with open source. Number of them, like MongoDB, Elastic, or HashiCorp, right? They have abandoned open source licenses altogether. Somebody like Red Hat, they've been more creative. I recently spoke at the conference in UK, and our British friends taught me a word about what Red Hat is doing. They say they are bastardizing open source in terms of really trying to stick to the words of a GPL license, what they can use, right? But not really the spirit, right? To make sure they can still call the solution at Red Hat Linux open source, right? But then not really allow people to get the freedoms you would expect with the open source software. Now, what I think is also interesting in this regard is what we can see with the corporate world, what you cannot quite trust corporate promises. Again, I leave that through with that MySQL industry. Because at the point when MySQL was acquired, there actually have been a number of suitors, not just Sun. Right? When MySQL management team and shareholders speak to be acquired by Sun, because that was open source friendly company. Right? They really have a strong commitment to open source at the time, right? And the Oracle was that kind of like a worst enemy of MySQL. In MySQL, our mission was to run Oracle out of business, right? To kind of, at least in the database space, right? So MySQL wasn't wanted to be acquired by Oracle, but it ended up obviously in Oracle hands, right? And all their promises which MySQL may have been making to its customers, well, they obviously no more for that series of corporate acquisitions. And I think that's is a very important to remember. Now, some of the companies, you can see they are very open about their relationship with the open source, right, and why they do what they do, right? I very much like MongoDB for their honesty, because they say pretty much is what, hey guys, we built MongoDB and we open sourced it as a part of a freemium strategy, right? That is a good marketing, right? They would not pretend what, you know, what we are about making the world a better place, get the grass greener, right, and so on and so forth. Hey, that's, you know, how you market things initially. Well, and that worked very well for MongoDB. But there are some other companies which I think are a little bit less straightforward. Like, for example, when Elastic changed the license, they call it doubling down on open. Yes, we ditch open source license and we call it doubling down on open, right? Well, I don't know. To me, that doesn't sound like a very honest talk, right? And I think that is all highlights what you will see some companies doing, because the open source or open is seen as something kind of better, kind of better for customers, right? They try to play with words, right, by trying to make it sound that without actually sticking to open source value. So where the open source is good, right, and why do we have that interesting cycle of kind of using the open source first and then maybe ditching open source license later? Well, I think the open source is great for driving software adoption. Right? If you think about folks, especially developers, right, in a lot of cases, they want to give back. Right? If they are getting something for free, right, something very usable, hey, they often would like to give back by writing code, right, or saying, telling to other people about this. And this is why you would see that many open source software is a very efficient in marketing, right? Now, where proprietary licenses are a lot more efficient is at extracting value. Well, for obvious reasons, right? Because if you have an open source license, well, then everybody can use your software for free, right? And you can have to find a way to convince some folks to pay, which is typically, you know, would be a relatively small portion of your user base, right? Where in a proprietary software case, well, you can choose to have everybody paying, right, and have all the leverage you want, right? That is the reason why we see a lot of companies in the early stage. Then the adoption is important, choosing the open source, and then they reach some sort of a saturation point. They and have to focus on monetization. They choose to go to choose some other non-open source license. Now, what about those open source license? Right. The first thing I want to state is, hey, you know what? Those companies, of course, have a very good lawyers involved, and those license changes are legal, right? That is why often they would ask you to sign something like a contributor license agreement, right? Or developer certificate of origin, granting things of some to a project on some very liberal license. So the company then can relicense combined wall any way we like, right? Of course, it is a question to what extent they are ethical, right, or break implicit or explicit promises, right? For many projects, you would see many developers work together, right, to create them, often with assumption what they are going to be able to use the fruits of their labor in perpetuity, right? And then if their main vendor chooses unilaterally to change the license, well, obviously they cannot have that anymore. We can see that, for example, in Elastic case, right? I think Elastic case is very interesting because it had a very large community which included a lot of vendors making money on the Elastic technology. And of course, also kind of contributing to that development, right? When they changed the license, well, it became a problem for those people, and that is why Elastic OpenSearch was born, because there was a need, and then it was also the critical mass of developers not employed by Elastic who could make a fork happen. Something else is interesting about Elastic. And you can see what, by the time they have been doing the license change, they have been getting quite flat. And you can see actually afterwards they have been a little bit dropping in adoption, at least by DB Engine's measures, where OpenSearch was taken off the market. But I think that that confirms a theory for me, what a lot of companies choose to change that license when they are very close to saturation point, right? Another example probably many of you are aware of is HashiCorp changing the license. Also, if you think about that, HashiCorp was and Terraform were pretty much ubiquitous in the space, right? They could not have more developers, right, to know about Terraform, right? So it was time to shift from driving adoption and kind of being loved to extracting money, right, from that ecosystem, and so hence license change happened. Okay, so as I mentioned in this case, the early stage of success is often depends on the community involvement, right? And then at the later time, the companies often have a lot of money, and then they rely a lot less, or need to rely a lot less on community for driving the product success. Okay. The question you may ask is, with all those kind of problems described, is there some different way to approach the open source? And actually we can see it pretty well, right? You can see some of the more successful projects in the ecosystem have non-profit project ownership, right? If you think about Linux or Kubernetes or in the database space, the Postgres, right, all are not controlled by the single entity. What is also interesting, in majority of those cases, you would also find multiple competing vendors, right? So, for example, all those Red Hat shenanigans, can they actually kill Linux? Not really. Right? Even if, IBM decides to completely kill Red Hat tomorrow, well, there are Ubuntu, SUSE, bunch of other Linux vendors which will take over. And I think that is fantastic. That is what makes the open source project really stable And that is what gives companies really a choice. Because reality is, while if you're thinking about developers, they may be interacting with what I would call like a raw open source project, right? Say, hey, I get a code from GitHub, work with it, right? I download Postgres from PostgreSQL.org, right, and wherever. But if you look at the majority of the enterprises using open source, they need commercial relationship. They don't have skills, right? They cannot take a risk. They want to deal with a vendor, right? Whether that would be a vendor like one of those, right? Or whether that would be, cloud vendor who is also taking responsibility for Linux, right? Another open source we have. But they do not want to take that risk, and that is a choice. I think where a lot of value of open source is created. Now, if you think what is important here when we talk about the community ownership, that is the governance, right? We really need to look at the open source projects in terms of the governance for benefit of their whole ecosystem at large and not the single vendor, right? Because obviously if that is the single vendor project, well, it is run for benefit of that vendor, right? Like, for example, if you look at the MySQL that's acquired by Oracle, right? And frankly, to be honest, Oracle ran it very well for a number of years, right? Everybody were fearing, oh my gosh, that Oracle will kill MySQL, instantly after acquisition. But what we can see now is Oracle is obsessed with a heat wave, right? And the MySQL is kind of as a little heatwave appendix, if you will, right? A lot of very cool innovations, Oracle only sends to the cloud only heatwave, right? Think about AI, things like a vector search extensions. Well, that's heatwave kind of cloud only, right? Or some analytical extensions and so on and so forth, right? That is not in the benefit of the MySQL ecosystem as a whole, right? MySQL developers would want to see those features in the open source community, but that cannot happen, at least not as a part of a core MySQL, right? That may happen in MariaDB. Some of that may come to, Percona server, like the MySQL fork what we maintain, but unfortunately not unlikely in the mainstream. So what else is important beyond governance, right? That is, of course, who has the ownership. And often when you talk about the open source project, you think about the source code. And I think that is important, but you also need to be thinking about the other things like trademarks. Right, that is very important, right? For example, when they speak about HashiCorp, right? Hey, you had the code and a very liberal license for Terraform, right? And it got forked, right? Well, but reality is what only HashiCorp get to call their stuff Terraform now, right? The other guys who essentially maintain the spirit of a project, the license of a project, right? And maybe even they have kind of larger pool of community moves, they have to pick a different name, right? With like an open tofu because they don't have a trademark, right? So non-profit trademark ownership in this case is also very important, right? And as well as the distribution channels. Right, hey, that means, well, whatever it means, right? At some point, meant Linux distributions. That's your website to what people got used to. That's, what is being installed by default when you do a Docker pull, right? All this kind of stuff, right? Because that is, again, really controls what the project is. It's majority of its users' minds, and that is what is really the upstream battle for many of those projects. Think about OpenSearch or OpenTofu, right, to really replace those channels and the mind share for people. Also, the community is very important, right? And then often I see people talk about community as if it's kind of something singular, right? I tend to think if you really want successful projects, you really need to think about the three separate kind of communities. Well, the first one is, of course, user community, people who actually use a project, right? And in certain cases, people who use the projects, they are also people who would be developing it, extending it, but not always. Think about something like database or Linux operating system. Majority of people just use them, maybe to build the applications, right, and so on and so forth, right, and don't really get inside because that is a very specific and different skills. Right? Then there is a contributor community. These are people actually who make a software better, right, or work on it. And we want that to be diverse and not controlled by the single vendor, in this case for a project to be really stable and successful. And finally is a vendor community. Again, I would claim if you would have an open source project and it only have really like one vendor, then for practical use case for majority of enterprises, that creates a lock-in. And also the lack of competition, it creates complacency. And what that means is a bad quality on a high cost, right? Totally opposite of what you would want to see and what competition provides. So I think what also interesting in an open source is what if you look at successful projects, we also have vendors which very much figured out this kind of competition game. When you can say we compete for business, but at the same time we all work together for the benefit of a project. Again, me coming from a database space, I would use Postgres as example, right? And it's kind of very interesting to see what there are so many PostgreSQL vendors everywhere, right? And their competition is, you know, pretty cutthroat, right? We at Percona compete in that space too. But at the same time, you go anywhere and there is a PostgreSQL conferences run by community. You know, there's probably like a PG day happening almost every week somewhere in the world, right there. All those companies participate to really promote Postgres together, right? And I think that is a very great example of how successful that can be. So I think what is interesting in this case, right, and what we will see from all those developments of the license changes and stuff is what we really need to understand that difference better. And not just talk about, oh, this is open source, which is kind of wonderful, but really understand there is a difference between the corporate governed open source, right, and their community, non-profit, right, whatever we call it, governed open source, which is governed from the benefit of the whole ecosystem. I think that will be increasingly important, as I think what we learned over the last 2 years is what we probably cannot really trust their enterprises, right, because of all the license changes. Another thing I want to highlight is what we need a better language for talking about the open source and proprietary. Because if you think about how things are positioned, especially by, you know, OSI, right, and some other, you know, open source zealots, they say, well, this is like an open source, and if you not OSI open source compatible, then you are at the dark side, right? Well, and that is a problem, right? And I think that causes a problem with attempts by any entities to redefine what open source means. Right, because they say, well, we don't want to be called the dark side. We're not as bad as Oracle, right? But the only other choice is to call ourselves at the is a kind of open source, right? We need to understand what really situation is something on the spectrum here, and have some more of a language to talk about that, which I don't think what we have very much established that in the industry, right? And if you think about this, right, that the spectrum goes from you kind of reserve all the rights, maximize monetization, your kind of classical cutthroat proprietary license, all the way to, public domain and a permissive open source licenses, right? But a lot of companies want to be somewhere in the middle. They can say, hey, you know what? We want to be source available because we want to prevent the competition from a cloud. That is the only way we can find a way to do a business. Well, and that is fantastic, right? It is better if such options exist compared to what they don't, right, in this case, because often that is a choice, and not a choice of everything being open source, right? As much as I love open source, I don't think that is practical, right? And that goes to this reality check, if you will. What open source is best, but there is a lot of shade of gray before we came to that, cutthroat, classical, proprietary license. Okay. Now, in the last part, let me talk briefly about the cloud and open source, right? And I think you may hear from a number of people about this kind of a cloud and killing open source and all their stuff. Now, I think that is not exactly correct way to think about that. I think the better way to think about that is what cloud is killing some open source based business models. Because remember, open source itself is not a business model. Open source does not prescribe a particular business model, right? And you know what? It doesn't even need open source business model, right? As I mentioned, there have been open source in the early days when people, just created that, well, for fun, in this case. So cloud is killing some open source business model, and of course, well, people who relied on those models, they are not particularly happy about that, as I'm sure, horse carriage operators were not quite happy about how their business evolved, a century plus ago. So I think what is interesting in this regard is to look at the change, especially kind of long term as things applied in open source. I mentioned already I got involved with open source in late 90s. And at that time, I started working with Linux, and that was kind of a joke, or a toy, right, whatever you call it, right? And just to tell a couple of things, well, it was like a 32-bit system, right, with very limited amount of memory it could address. It didn't really support multiple CPUs well. It really couldn't even support file more than 2 gigabytes in size. Right? I remember if you talk to kind of people who were working with serious real operating systems, Solaris, HPUX, AIX, wherever, like, oh my gosh, that was completely a complete joke, right? But in 20 plus years, we have made Linux a pretty much dominating server-side operating system. And I think what is interesting in this case is this image, which I took from Bruce Momjam's presentation, who is a very well-known PostgreSQL advocate, which says, well, you know what? If you think about the proprietary software, which you call like a closed source, right? Often that is where things start first, right? And then it's kind of maybe for years much better than the open source solutions, and then open source picks up later, and then it kind of gets like a small ball, and that can get the domination. And I think what we have a way to expect, what we will see the same trends to happen in the cloud world as well, right? Where right now we have on one side there are solutions like AWS, which have started before. They're kind of very polished, well integrated, and so on and so forth, but which really create that lock-in which drive a high cost and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we have cloud native foundation work, right? Just to flag specific that organization, which is based on open source, run everywhere. You have a choice of vendors, treat the cloud as commodity, and so on and so forth. But so far, it is not quite as polished as Amazon's, right, or Google's, or some other proprietary cloud technologies. Right? But if you think about that, it is getting better every year, right? More mature in terms of what it can offer, as well as more user-friendly. And I think it's kind of fantastic to see with many open source projects those days, this really focus, hey, we just want to make it easier and more user-friendly, not just high performance, right, and more features and so on and so forth. So does that mean what the cloud should be dead? Well, not really. I mean, I think what Amazon actually did a very good job kind of a few years ago, right, when they compared the cloud computing to electricity services, right, saying, hey guys, you know what, it doesn't make sense for most of us to run generators, at least most of the time, right? We can just buy utility computing, right, and the cloud is the same. But note, when you think about the electricity, it is a highly standardized commodity, right? You can buy electricity from every vendor and you can still run your TV, your microwave, your fridge, wherever. While what Amazon and other cloud folks have been doing right now, saying, hey guys, well, you know what? We'll give you the Amazon TV, right, and Amazon microwave, Amazon fridge, and you know what? They only work if you buy electricity from us. At that point, it doesn't make any sense anymore. We still want to get the commodity stuff, right, from cloud providers, but we want to get the value from the open source software. And I think that is what we're seeing right now with Kubernetes, right, which has a lot of growth, right, happening everywhere. The thing with Kubernetes in particular is what it became very much ubiquitous, right? You can run a Kubernetes and Kubernetes-based technologies on the edge, on-prem, on pretty much any cloud vendor, and not just those the first-tier clouds, right? But any second-tier clouds as well, right? You think about DigitalOceans, Linodes, Vultr, right? And that is fantastic. It also becomes increasingly easy to install everywhere. So let me finish by talking about this future of open source, which I would call what the future of open source is likely to be polarized, and us as an open source community really recognizing that difference more. On one extent, we'll have a commercial open source, right, which is saying, hey, we want to make sure what we are a business around the open source, right? You likely expect those companies to continue, pushing the boundaries, maybe redefine the open source, because, hey, you know what? In the end, is that kind of desire to have a cake and eat it too, right? In terms of maximizing the profit, shareholder value, and so on and so forth. And then there is this non-profit open source, right, which is focused on public good, open source freedoms, right, and the needs of the whole ecosystem, right? And I think that is where it makes sense for most of us to invest our time and effort. So let me finish with this call to action. I would encourage you to learn to spot the real open source, right, versus folks open source, which exists now in increasingly many variations. Invest your time, your resources as a company to make it better and spread the word. Well, that's all for me.
For questions if you want to take them.
Oh, of course, questions.
If anyone has any questions. Okay, there's one.
Yeah,
Oh,
we got a
yes, yeah, that's
question
right.
back here.
I'm looking at this thing which says, like, Peter, you have another 5 seconds to finish.
I was going to say, if no one has questions, I have questions for you, but I might have to say.
Oh, you know, you'll just have to warm up, you know. I've just seen, like, everybody's so shy here.
They'll come up afterwards. Don't worry. That's the pattern.
So when you were talking about needing new language, were you specifically just wanting different terminology, or do you want the OSI definition of open source expanded?
No. So what I'm saying is, the OSI, right, has the often mission defined as like, well, the defend open source definition, right? And again, it's like open source, and we don't care. What I'm saying is, what the OSI would be better to define that that spectrum in this case, so we can talk about the different variations, right? And example I have is Creative Commons. I think Creative Commons is doing a very good job, right, in this case, because there are very well-defined terms. And you can say, hey, if I want to license my content, so it's free, but only for non-commercial use, fantastic. There is, a thing for that. Right? Where in open source, it's just too black and white, which doesn't fit everybody's needs anymore. Make sense? Okay.
Any other questions besides Lisa's?
I know, I do. That
right
actually
me.
was.
Oh, we do have one over here.
Okay,
Lisa, is
perfect.
that okay?
That was one of my questions, so I'm glad you asked it.
Hi, so you mentioned how these commercial companies should adopt open source, and I think one thing you said was they can have your cake and eat it too. I thought about it a little bit. What is incentivizing a commercial company from using open source as opposed to, let's say, a closed source model where they can monetize it a little more than open source?
Well, if you think about using the open source, right, I mentioned in many cases you can get more the market and more adoption with an open source, especially if you think in certain areas, right, their open source already their established proprietary competitors already exist. Right, then creating open source alternative can be a viable business, right? You can see, I think, especially in the last few years, right, it's so interesting to see this like open source alternative to X appearing, right, and often being successful, right? Like, for example, I went to FOSDEM in Belgium recently, right? And we don't hear about them very much, but there is in Europe the solution called Odoo, right? This is like a small business ERP which competes with Salesforce, which competes with HubSpot and so on and so forth. They are open source, or actually like an open core, right, would be probably better definition company, right? And they're very successfully competing with those companies.
Okay, I think that is all the questions we have time for here, but that was a presentation very near and dear to my heart. As I mentioned before, I spent the last 3 years building the community at CockroachDB, so you know I had a lot of those licensing questions, and it was always interesting to answer them, and I do agree that the definition does need to be expanded. And my first question for you at the booth crawl will be around open source projects that are run by a foundation, and what do you think, what effect does that have versus open source that is not part of a foundation, and open source out in the wild. So we can talk about that at the booth crawl. So everybody give Peter a hand. He really gets it.